Alan Tate's Reactionary Essays on Poetry and Ideas was published in 1936. It is an important contribution to modern literary criticism, reflecting Tate's engagement with culture, modernity, and the philosophical foundations of poetic expression. As a leading figure among the fugitives and Southern agrarians, Tate approaches literature through a deeply historical, ethical, and metaphysical lens, insisting that poetry cannot be separated from the cultural conditions that shape human consciousness. He resists the modern tendency to dissolve literature into sociology or political ideology. The term reactionary in the title signals not a simple political stance but a deliberate resistance to the cultural disintegration he believed modern liberalism had unleashed, particularly the fragmentation of thought, the loss of tradition, and the weakening of metaphysical coherence. The opening chapters establish Tate's concern with what he calls the dissociation of sensibility, a condition in which intellect and emotion have seen severed in modern thought. This problem, later famously discussed by T.S. Eliot, becomes the foundation for Tate's argument that modern poetry suffers when rational abstraction dominates concrete experience. In the early essays, Tate analyzes the emergence of scientific rationalism and industrial modernity, arguing that these forces erode the symbolic imagination necessary for poetic creation. Poetry must restore the balance between thought and feeling, enabling a unified perception of the world. As the book progresses, Tate turns to the historical decline of metaphysical systems. He explores how the loss of traditional religious and philosophical frameworks has weakened the capacity for symbolic meaning. Without a shared metaphysical structure, poetry becomes either too subjective or too intellectual. Tate discusses poets such as John Donne and Thomas Hardy to illustrate how symbolic complexity is possible only within a coherent cultural worldview. Donne represents an integrated sensibility, while Hardy reveals the struggle of a poet working in a fragmented modern landscape. He uses these comparisons to illuminate the broader crisis of culture. A poet cut off from metaphysical grounding cannot unify experience through form. The later chapters expand this argument by applying it to contemporary literature. Tate critiques modern poets and critics for their excessive individualism and their reliance on personal expression detached from historical consciousness. The modern poet often becomes a solitary self referential voice because he lacks communal tradition. These chapters also contain extended reflections on the role of the critic, whose responsibility, in Tate's view, is not to judge poetry by political or moral usefulness, but to examine how form embodies a coherent vision of experience. He cautions against the growing trend of sociological criticism, which he believes reduces poetry to documentary evidence rather than recognizing it as a symbolic, imaginative construction. Tate analyzes Dante and the medieval worldview as a model of organic unity. Dante exemplifies a poet whose symbolic imagination was grounded in a fully integrated metaphysical order. Modern poets operate in a secular world lacking metaphysical certainty. This comparison is not nostalgic but diagnostic. Tate argues that modern literature must reckon honestly with its philosophical homelessness rather than retreat into sentimentality or empty abstraction. The concluding chapters address the cultural implications of poetic decline. Tate argues that poetry is a vital mode of human knowledge, one that illuminates dimensions of experience unavailable to scientific or rational discourse. When poetry loses its symbolic depth, culture itself becomes impoverished, dominated by utilitarian thinking and technological efficiency. Tate ends by calling for a renewed commitment to tradition, discipline, and metaphysical seriousness, not as a return to the past, but as a necessary foundation for meaningful creation.